All right, we're on to section 4, punctuation crash course. So I do this crash course on punctuation not because this should be the focus of our writing, or that we should think that because we punctuate well, our writing is somehow good. We've discussed the writing process, we've discussed how to organize our ideas, how to write good paragraphs, how to write good conclusions, and so on. That's the focus of college writing. A punctuation crash course is simply to remember the things we should have already learned in previous English classes in high school and throughout our lives, and also just to refine or to clean up our writing so that it's not sloppy with punctuation mistakes. So let's start today by talking about commas and comma splices. First, we'll discuss when to use commas properly. The first place to use commas is in a series. So commas separate the different items in a series or list. And remember that a conjunction, and or will follow the last comma. And some people debate whether or not that's necessary, that we need a comma at the end. In college writing, always put a comma before the and or the or at the end of your list or series. For example, I visited the museum with Sarah, Rachel, and Mike. Okay, so comma between each item in the list, and an and a comma before the last conjunction or and in the list. We also need to remember when we use terms like etc. or so forth, that those are preceded by and followed by a comma. For example, I went with Sarah, Rachel, etc. to the museum. It's kind of a silly sentence, but that's how we would punctuate a sentence like that. Sarah, Rachel, etc., comma. Good. Another example, I told the lawyer about the accident, the victims, and so forth before I went to court. So a comma before and after words like etc. and so forth. Good. The next time we use a comma is in introductory phrases. Introductory phrases are those at the beginning of a sentence that explain when, where, why, how, or the circumstances of the action occurring in the sentence. For example, when Sam turns 16, he will receive his driver's license. So we don't use a comma if a verb directly follows the introductory phrase. For example, from the sky fell the skydiver. However, if a verb does not directly follow the introductory phrase, if the noun or the subject follows, then we need to have a comma after that introductory phrase. We also use a comma after a conjunctive adverb at the beginning of a sentence. For example, nevertheless. Nevertheless, the artist's favorite medium is watercolor. Okay, so after conjunctive adverbs like nevertheless, we need a comma when it's at the beginning of a sentence. And also within this introductory phrase category, we have interjections. So we always need a comma if we have an interjection at the beginning of a sentence, like, no way, I hope he's okay. Another time we use commas is with independent clauses. Independent clauses, or an independent clause, is a group of words that can be a sentence on its own. So we need to use a comma when two independent clauses are combined using a conjunction. So remember, our conjunctions are and, or, but, etc. I love to read, but I hate going to the library. So I love to read is an independent clause. It has a verb-noun combination. And I hate going to the library is also an independent clause. It has its own verb and noun combination. And when I'm putting these two together with a conjunction, but, then we need to use a comma. I love to read, but I hate going to the library. However, you don't need to use a comma when the two clauses share the same subject. So, I love to read, but hate going to the library. If you notice, that's actually the more correct way of doing it, because I'm sharing the subject. I love to read, but hate going to the library. In the previous example, if we would have used something different than I in the second independent clause, for example, I love to read, but my mom hates going to the library, or but my friends hate going to the library, or but my dog hates going to the library, then it would have been perfect. Okay? So for sharing the subject between both clauses, then we don't need a comma and we don't need a comma before the conjunction. If we are changing the subject, that is when we need a comma before the conjunction between two independent clauses. The next time we use commas are for restrictive or non-restrictive modifiers. So a restrictive modifier is a word or phrase that modifies a noun and is essential to the meaning of the sentence. And when that is the case with a restrictive modifier, we do not use a comma. For example, the album was very good. A non-restrictive modifier, information that is not essential to convey the basic meaning of the sentence, we'd need to use not only one comma, but a pair of commas. For example, the album featuring Jennifer Lopez was very good. Okay, so a non-restrictive modifier is that information that is not essential to the basic meaning of the sentence. So the basic meaning was the album was very good, but we're adding information, so we use a pair of commas to separate that extra information from the rest of the sentence. We also use commas to separate two or more adjectives before a noun. The movie is an unusual, horrifying example of online bullying. So we have unusual and horrifying, two adjectives before the noun, so we separate those with a comma. Another critical place that we need to use commas is when we introduce a quotation. My instructor said we should usually use a comma to introduce a quotation. Okay, so when we're using a direct quotation, we often will introduce that quotation with a comma. However, if the quotation is part of the sentence grammatically, you don't need to use a comma. For example, my instructor said that we should usually use a comma to introduce a quotation. Okay, so I have my instructor said that replaces the comma. So an incorrect version would be my instructor said that, comma, we should usually use a comma to introduce a question, or a quotation, sorry. So we don't need a comma after that. Another time when we use commas is dates and places. Place a comma after the day and before the year in the month, day, year style of writing dates. So August 19th, 2014. So we don't have a comma after the month, but we have a comma after the day. So between the day and the year. We also use a comma to separate the city from a state or the state from the country. For example, Salt Lake City, comma, Utah, or Utah, comma, USA. The final place that we use commas is what are called elliptical constructions. So it's when we use a comma to show the omission of a word where the meaning can be inferred quite easily. For example, Susan bought 10 books. Henry, comma, 2. So the comma after Henry shows the omission of the word bought, because it can be inferred that since Susan bought 10 books, Henry is also buying 2, right? Susan bought 10 books, Henry, comma, 2. Now on to the biggest mistake that students make in their use of commas. And that would be what's called a comma splice. A comma splice is when only a comma is used to separate two independent clauses. So before, remember we said if we have two independent clauses, we need a comma and a conjunction. Lots of students like to use a comma without a conjunction. For example, try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven when they are done. The timer should go off in a few minutes. Okay, so we have two independent clauses separated by nothing but a comma. And that is a comma splice. Another thing students do too often is what's called a fused sentence, and that is when you combine two independent clauses without any punctuation. Try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven. When they are done, the timer should go off in a few minutes. Okay, so we have two completely independent clauses separated with no punctuation. We fused those together. So let's look at some possible solutions of both of these. First, we could use a period to create two separate sentences out of the two independent clauses. For example, try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven when they are done, period. The timer should go off in a few minutes. Something else we could do is to use a semicolon to connect two closely related independent clauses. So try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven when they are done, semicolon. The top should be golden brown. Okay, so when they are done is very closely related to the idea of the tops of the muffins being golden brown, so we can use a semicolon. So we're getting away from the muffins theme now. I'm just talking about solutions of fixing comma splices or fused sentences. The next way is to use a colon to show a strong explanatory or sequential relationship between the two independent clauses. For example, I had to make an impossible decision, colon. Do I obey God or the government? The final thing we can do is use a coordinating conjunction. Again, we use a comma, or we place a comma before the coordinating conjunction. I am starving, comma, so I think I'll order pizza. Okay, so that gives you a basic crash course on commas and on the two most common mistakes that students make in their use of commas, and with some basic solutions of how to fix those. So when you're rereading or revising your papers, look for places where you've used two independent clauses and separated them only by a comma, which is a comma splice, or when you've fused multiple independent clauses together with no punctuation, and use these solutions to fix that. Okay, so if you have any questions about commas, please let me know, and I'll try to clear those up for you. And that's it for our first lecture on your punctuation crash course.